Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, and welcome to our TrafLab second event this year on minimum wage and minimum wage laws and social equality. So in recent weeks, it seems like everywhere you look, in Israel at least, somebody is saying something bad against minimum wage laws. But around the world as well. So the World Bank, in a draft of the World Development Report, suggested that it is time, and I quote, to remove some of the most stringent labor regulations, legislated minimum wages, constraints on hiring and dismissal decision, severance pay, and limited set of contracts, with a goal of leveling the playing field between workers and capitalists while protecting all workers. Along the same lines, Professor Avi Simchon called for the exclusion of migrant workers from protective employment legislation such as minimum wage law. This is really what kind of brought about this event, our alarm from this suggestion. And just 2 days ago, the Ministry of Finance came out against raising the minimum wage in Israel, saying that it will create unemployment. This is what we're going to talk about today, and this is going to be a conversation between labor and migration scholars about these issues. So there are going to be no economists on the panel now, and this is not because this is not an important interdisciplinary question to resolve, but because I think the economic point here is quite straightforward and almost intuitive in some way. And I think it requires some more serious thought, consideration, and responses from people who are working on labor, migration, and social equality, who tend to support minimum wage laws. So Professor Brishan Rogers, who's joining us today, wrote one of the most well thought through and smart pieces on the topic, so I'm super excited to have him with us today. Brishan is a professor of law at Temple University. His current research explores the relationship among labor and employment law, technological development, just at a conference yesterday he discussed it, and economic and social equality. He's writing a book on the topic at MIT Press, so there's something for us to look forward to. And prior to law school, he worked as a community organizer promoting living wage policies and affordable housing. And he's here with us today to talk to us about this paper that he wrote a little while back, but is super relevant to us. Then we'll have a roundtable panel, and I'll introduce the other panelists later. So thank you so much for coming. And you will have to put this on as well, just for the tape, for the video. So thank you.
How's that? Good? Yeah, good. Okay, great. So thank you so much, Hila, for the introduction. Thank you for having me here. Thank you to the Safra Center as well, and to Guy, Asaf, and Hani for agreeing to be here as commentators. I want to talk about two things, basically. The role of minimum wage laws, and I think in some ways by extension work regulations more generally, in a just society. This is the first topic. I think it's a difficult question in some ways, at least if one works within standard liberal theories of justice. It's an especially vexed question if in situations in which membership in a society is in flux due to immigration, migration, and the like. So, for example, whether guest workers deserve full labor and employment law protections depends, I think, a little bit on how one thinks about the geographic and collective boundaries of justice. I do actually think there's a strong case for minimum wage laws that is rooted in Rawlsian liberal justice. And I think that case extends to guest workers, though it needs some further elaboration in ways that I think I'll discuss. Part of one of the moves here is to kind of bring social theory, history, and political economy together with the somewhat abstract or even metallic character of Rawlsian justice and liberal theorizing about justice as it's often carried out. And to sort of preview my final argument around guest workers, if one looks to history and political economy, if one looks at history and political economy, you can't help noticing that nominally democratic societies have a very long history of denying full civil and political rights to certain classes of workers. And that denial, whether it occurs through slavery or through other sorts of forced labor or dual-tier citizenship programs or guest worker programs and the like, strikes me as sufficiently widespread that we really, as labor scholars, ought to be seen it as central rather than marginal to the law and political economy of production. Hila and Guy, of course, have done work on exactly these lines. This is and remains a major source of historical injustice, and egalitarians should take account of such patterns when considering what is right and good. So to preview my conclusion on the second point, yes, I do think that migrant workers and guest workers deserve minimum wage protections and most likely something close to the full suite of labor and employment law protections, if not the full suite. We could talk about some marginal exclusions perhaps. Okay, into the minimum wage. Can we defend it on grounds of justice? I think we can, though a surprising number of theorists have actually expressed skepticism toward it. And that's come from both the broadly defined right and the broadly defined left. The sort of right-leaning arguments are fairly common and easy to summarize. We hear them from, I would categorize the World Bank's arguments about this in that category. From a welfarist view, minimum wage laws can decrease demand for low-wage labor, putting some segment of low-wage workers out of work because they raise the price of labor. So simply, if one adopts a neoclassical model of labor markets, this is straightforward. Now, the story gets complicated very quickly, but surely at some point, if we are going to increase minimum wages very, very high, that will have a significant disemployment effect. There's also a right libertarian argument that I probably won't say much about, holding that minimum wage laws restrict individuals' freedom in the market in a sort of Lochnerian sense, and are therefore a bad idea. Put that to the side for now. I think the more interesting and troubling set of arguments come from liberal egalitarians, or thinkers who follow John Rawls in believing both in liberalism, meaning a state that remains neutral toward the good, and inequality, or that the state needs to create and maintain a set of basic institutions that ensure roughly equal access to resources or opportunities or some thing that's going to be equalized. Rawls' work on justice generally sparked a wide-ranging debate on distributive justice, or the fundamental fairness of the distribution of resources and other social goods in society. Because minimum wage laws are typically enacted in order to raise wages and therefore to reduce income inequality and deliver more resources to the working poor, one would think that they would be central to theorizing about how to achieve distributive justice. One would be wrong. Here a couple of quotes may actually be helpful. So the first is from Ann Alstott, who's a leading tax scholar. I feel a little bit bad whenever I make this argument because Ann Alstott no longer takes this position. But in any event, she said it in 1999 in an article in the Yale Law Journal that's quite prominent, so it's out there. She said as follows: if the poor were guaranteed a modest income, the government could more readily reduce or eliminate the minimum wage and other market regulations that are adopted in the name of fairness. Inviting the question why one might want to do that, but her assumption is one might want to do that in order to ensure the broadest swath of possible employment opportunities. Philip von Parijs, the philosopher and economist who's most closely associated with basic income, has made pretty similar statements about both minimum wages and unionization, both in his original book, Real Freedom for All, that's kind of the core modern case for universal basic income. And in a more popular book that came out last year, he argues that with a basic income in place, we could reduce the minimum wage in order to make sure that everyone could have access to the labor market. And that this would be desirable because it would allow people who were priced out of the labor market to find work. Rawls himself alluded to this view, though he never quite embraced it. So I'll skip over exactly what he said, but I'm happy to come back to it. And Alstott and von Parijs are not alone. So what explains this liberal skepticism? Again, I think it's somewhat odd in the sense that these are philosophers and thinkers who have very strong commitments to economic equality, and yet they are skeptical towards or even opposed towards policies that are generally adopted in the name of equality. Well, I think there are a few things. One is that liberal egalitarians have basically accepted the neoclassical model of labor markets and the welfarist understanding of the effect of minimum wages on the labor market. I'm not sure why this is. They certainly could work with other models of the labor market that have more empirical support. But at least intellectually, I think there is a clear conceptual overlap between liberal egalitarian theorizing and neoclassical theory. Both of them are quite heavily individualist, I think, in their methodology, and committed to individual free choice within markets or within political systems. And so if one starts from liberal egalitarian premises and adopts a neoclassical model of the labor market, perhaps one starts to think fairly soon that minimum wage laws and other restrictions on the sale of labor may actually harm workers more than they help them. The second reason that liberals may be skeptical is that the minimum wage is not well targeted at the working poor, since it applies identically to middle-class teenagers and to working poor individuals who are supporting families. There's a powerful strand of liberal egalitarian thought, often called luck egalitarianism, though that term is disputed, which holds that distributive justice requires that outcomes be what Dworkin has called endowment insensitive but ambition sensitive, meaning that people shouldn't be penalized for accidents of birth, such as their class, their gender, their racial identity, but they should be responsible for their own choices. Without going deeper into the idea, I just note it suggests some skepticism toward a state policy that treats middle-class teenagers and single parents equally because they're not equally deserving of state support. So in both the sort of classic Rawlsian framework and a luck egalitarian framework, it seems optimal to help the poor through direct transfers rather than wage regulations. That could take the form of cash grants or tax benefits or other such programs. The point being, and the difference being, that these programs would target people based on need rather than on their labor market position. There is, I think, a third plausible reason for liberal skepticism that's rooted in liberal commitments to neutrality. I think this argument's less convincing, but I will mention it. Alstad and Van Parijs have both argued that a liberal society shouldn't discriminate between people based upon whether or not they've chosen to work. Now, the context here is important. Both of them are arguing that welfare benefits or other basic social benefits should be delinked from work requirements, which I wholeheartly agree with. Rawls took a different position on this issue, and I don't want to go into great detail on it, in part because in part because I don't think Alstott would take the same position today. But in any event, I offer this to help understand the old Alstott position. If liberal neutrality prevents the state from rewarding certain sorts of activities like work over others, then at least some work regulations may be suspect because they signal state approval of work over other types of activities, socially valuable activities, such as care work. And here we are talking about market work, right, rather than care work. I'll just say, I think this is a very strange understanding of the requirements of liberal neutrality, because the requirement is not that the state remain neutral toward all conceptions of the good. If so, how could we have any regulation at all? How could we require that people go to school, for example? It's that the state has to be neutral toward comprehensive ethical theories and moral theories, such as religiously based theories, or perhaps, theories of the good, such as libertarianism. And so I think the Alstott-Van Parijs argument about neutrality is overstated in this regard. In any event, there's a policy convergence here. Liberal egalitarians and law and economics types both support transfers over regulations as means of ensuring economic equality. I'll pause and go off script, so forgive me if I don't find the exact words very quickly here. There is, of course, no one in reality is debating simply having transfers or simply having minimum wages in the real world, right? I don't know that there's any advanced industrial economy that doesn't do both. We have a combination of workplace regulations, welfare transfers, social insurance type benefits, and the like. However, I do think that this argument is very important to take on because, again, Van Parijs and Alstott, in their ideal theories, do think that we could do with a deregulated labor market, and I think that that's actually a very serious mistake. Okay, so the classic left response here is actually to kind of question the evidence, right? Say minimum wages don't really destroy jobs, or they tend to only reduce employment marginally. So that so that the workers who are beneficiaries of minimum wage laws end up making out ahead in the aggregate anyway. And that's absolutely what the evidence shows, in fact. But I want to put it to the side because, again, I want to focus on kind of an almost ideal theory type project, sort of ideal theory, I don't know. The problem with this argument, though, is it turns an argument about principle into an empirical dispute, right? And it doesn't really give us much sense for why it is that we would want to support minimum wages. And that's kind of the impulse that I want to unpack. Exactly what is it about minimum wages that most people find so appealing? Okay. So let's assume minimum wage laws actually have the effect of contracting the labor market. Let's assume that they actually do reduce low-wage employment. Are they still defensible? I think they absolutely are. They have important distributive effects, but that's actually not even kind of the key thing that they do. The scope of social justice is quite a bit broader than distribution. I think it's sort of a mistake to think about this simply as a matter of distributive justice, where that is understood as a question of resources or material social goods. Here, it's probably worth quoting Elizabeth Anderson, who's written some of the best stuff here. She says, the appropriate negative goal of egalitarian justice is eliminating oppression, which by definition is socially imposed. It's not a matter of one's relationship to the state, but rather a relationship between citizen A, citizen B, and the state. And the appropriate positive goal of egalitarian justice is ensuring that people stand in relationships of equality to one another. Call this a notion of social equality or democratic equality, perhaps. I think it can be seen quite clearly in the demands of progressive social movements. So feminists, for example, and this is one of Anderson's examples, haven't just sought additional resources to compensate for unpaid care work. That would be a sort of parallel suggested reform in care work debates, but rather to broader changes to family law, employment law, and other laws to ensure full equality for women, full social and economic equality for women. Labor movements have consistently demanded both material gains and greater respect on the job. There's an American slogan, bread and roses, meaning we want not just bread, not just material, not just enough to live on, but the good things in life. We want equal respect of some sort. In a way, this actually, here's a place where I'm not sure I would write the paper the same way for any of you who read the paper. This is kind of, it's not necessarily a question of equality per se, it's almost a question of dignity, right, or a conception of dignity. And something about the state or quality of being, the quality of being worthy of honor or respect, right, the right to be treated as a moral equal to others. But it's more foundational than how we typically think about equality itself. It actually is something about just the moral worth of the individual. Dignity is a very hard value to pin down, but I do think it is quite clearly informing a lot of egalitarian normative theories. So Michael Walzer describes democratic citizenship, and I quote, as a status radically disconnected from every kind of hierarchy. Elizabeth Anderson, I'm skipping over a couple, Elizabeth Anderson has argued that the aim of justice is to ensure relations of equality. And as pointed out, here's another quote, in inegalitarian societies, those of superior rank were thought entitled to inflict violence on inferiors, to exclude or segregate them from social life, to treat them with contempt, to force them to obey, to work without reciprocation, or to abandon their own cultures. One could even reach back to Marx here and his famous description of the labor contract and labor process in Capital Volume 1. He has this wonderful sort of narrative of the laborer and the capitalist meeting in the market and entering into a contract. And he says, this is a very Eden of the rights of man. There alone rule freedom, equality, property, and Bentham. Very famous language. The exchange in the market is free and equal in market terms, and yet once that agreement has been reached, here to quote again, there's a change in the physiognomy. You are just in time.
I'm sorry.
There's a change in the physiognomy of our dramatis personae. No, you're just in time for this. He who was the money owner now strides in front as the capitalist. The possessor of labor power follows as his laborer. The one with an air of importance, smirking, intent on business. The other, timid and holding back, like one who is bringing his own hide to market and has nothing to expect but a hiding, meaning a whipping. Now, this is all quite high-minded, right? Anderson is talking about very severe inequalities, such as racial or caste segregation. Marx, of course, is discussing the indignities of the labor contract itself. My goals are much more modest to simply say the minimum wage is a good idea. It is obviously neither, it is, the harms of not having a minimum wage are not the harms of being a slave, and the benefits of having a minimum wage are not the benefits of living under socialism. Having a minimum wage does not make workers free, right? But my point is that they're at least just. They're a sensible part of an overall system of social institutions, and there's no reason to oppose them on grounds of liberal justice. So why is this? Because they help to combat status inequalities that emerge out of the labor process. And this is a value independent of their impact on economic inequalities when all other economic phenomena are taken into account. There are a couple key arguments here, but I'll focus on 3.5. The first is sort of the most obvious, and I put more emphasis on it in the paper than I would today, that they increase wages, obviously, which enhances self-respect in a way by signaling that society values individuals' labor. This is, I think, a slippery argument, though, for a couple reasons. If wages are only high because the state mandates them to be high, then it's not clear they can actually help that much with self-respect. If one earns close to the minimum wage, at that point one is marked as one requiring state protection, which may undermine as much as advance self-respect. Jan Elster has made a version of this argument. If we create public jobs so that everyone has the dignity of a job, then those who move into public jobs will not necessarily be dignified because they'll know that they simply got this because of their disfavored social position. The argument's also sort of workerist in a possibly bad sense, right? We shouldn't attach quite so much dignity to paid work as opposed to other valuable social practices. In the argument's defense, we can't will away our society's connection between work and dignity, obviously. And dignity is multifaceted. We have rights to dignified work, one would say, if we want it, but there are other facets of dignity, including a right to a minimal standard of living regardless of work. In any event, that's the first argument, and I'm less convinced by it today than maybe I was a few years ago. The second argument is, I think, more important, that minimum wage laws alter workplace and even social power relationships. And here, one can draw from the old legal realist idea that the state, whenever there is a conflict between citizens or individuals, can't just do nothing. It sets and enforces background rules that structure the parties' behavior and incentives and outcomes. At common law, workers have no rights to decent pay, and the quality of their jobs is determined by market forces and their employers' strategic behavior. Minimum wages alter that dynamic. So the possession of rights against one's employer is actually, in some ways, a powerful signal of economic and social equality. What's happened is the state has affirmatively decided to intervene in the labor relationship that would otherwise lead to some class and status-based harms, and said workers are entitled to protection in the market and social sphere from a more powerful entity that might otherwise do harm to you. The alternative here is that the employer acts as he or she likes and the state does nothing, in which case the state is actually permitting or facilitating the employer's abuse. So the state's affirmative protection against another social party strikes me as actually quite important. This was captured nicely by a textile worker quote in 1935. I will read it. I have to say, the quote is almost so perfect that I suspect that I wonder whether the journalist cooked it a tiny bit. But anyway, this was right after minimum wage came into effect, and it was a textile worker who said, and I quote, "You can guess the money is handy, but there's something more than the money. There's knowing that the working men don't stand alone against the bosses and their smart lawyers and all their tricks." Us lawyers. "There's a government now that cares whether things is fair for us. The government is actually looking out for us finally, and this makes me feel more dignified." So the minimum wage here is not about the money, or it's not only about the money, it's about the dignity that comes along with it, which is reflected in the state protections. Okay, third, minimum wage laws are superior to transfers in that they levy duties on individuals and companies in proportion to the benefits that they obtain from low-wage work. Rather than taxing everyone and sending money through the state, which is an alien body that no one's ever seen, right? The money comes directly from the employer. That is important. More importantly, the employer owes the duty because the employer is him or herself getting class and status benefits from employing low-wage labor. So in a way, the minimum wage is a tax on those benefits, right? It taxes employers for gaining class and status benefits from low-wage labor. To to return to the economics for just a moment, this is a very interesting and under kind of discussed point. There's a fair amount of empirical evidence that minimum wage laws, the bulk of the costs of them are actually borne by the wealthy and by wealthy families and by businesses, because one of the major effects is they tend to reduce profits, reduce returns to capital. That ends up actually coming out of the pockets of wealthier investors or business owners. So it's not even middle class families who necessarily bear the brunt. Rather, they're a surprisingly effective way of redistributing from the wealthy to the working poor. Okay, there's a fourth kind of overarching argument here, which is that minimum wages encourage a more egalitarian political economy. And what do I mean by that? Well, we can think about, I hate the terminology, but it's useful, predistribution versus redistribution, right? That there are virtues in terms of having a stable set of progressive distributive institutions. There are virtues to doing that through market regulations rather than through the tax and transfer process, because market regulations or unionization, for example, tends to lead to more stable distributions of income over time as compared to tax and transfer policies. There's an empirical question here, but I think the basic idea is sort of clear enough. Even more than that, I'd say, part of the goal of minimum wage laws and other workplace regulations is to kind of weave egalitarian norms of equal concern, respect for one another into the social fabric, and therefore to make them more stable in the long run. You create institutions, you create expectations, you create norms of fair treatment. Law can do this only indirectly, but if it has the capacity to encourage those norms, those can be quite stable. And the whatever new equilibrium we reach may then incorporate those norms in a beneficial way. Okay. What about contractions in the labor market? There are a few here, turning to counter arguments for a moment. There are quite a few responses. The most important, which I think the left should embrace, is that many low-wage jobs may simply not be worth saving in their current form. To the extent that we do face any kind of a tragic choice between employing workers at minimum wage and losing, employment in some very low-wage sectors, we maybe ought to be prepared to simply say that's a type of work, an industry that we don't want in this country anymore. The garment sector in the U.S. is a nice example. We still have a garment sector. It still has a sweatshop problem. We could say good riddance. That doesn't eliminate the problem entirely because it pushes it sort of into another jurisdiction. But in any event, I do think that it is a valid argument. And even when jobs aren't lost en masse, marginally reduced demand in some very low-wage sectors can be an affirmative good. I think there would be nothing wrong and a great deal beneficial about having fewer restaurant trips from upper-middle-class families in the United States, for example, if all restaurant workers start earning $15 per hour, right? We would have marginally fewer restaurants, marginally fewer restaurant workers, but less class differentiation that occurs through that consumption process. I actually think that's fine. Especially because work-linked transfers, such as earned income tax credits, tend to positively encourage the use of very low-wage labor, often by giving an implicit subsidy to employers. The same is not likely true, though we don't have good data, of basic income programs, right? Non-work-linked transfers do not necessarily subsidize employers, but work-linked transfers do tend to. Okay. I don't want to overemphasize how much work the minimum wage can do also, right? Robust unionization may be a better means of ensuring social equality, since it doesn't just compress wages, but gives workers democratic rights. But I do think the minimum wage can do a great deal of work, and getting some a better grasp of these questions can help to answer questions such as questions about the place of unionization in a just society. So, okay, my hope is this rebuts the liberal case against the minimum wage and even builds a sort of modified liberal case for the minimum wage, based on the idea that an egalitarian society at bottom will promote decent work that really enhances rather than undermines self-respect. Let me say a bit about the proposal that Dr. Shamir mentioned at the beginning. I'm going to mispronounce his name. Simhon? Yeah? Okay, I'm not going to. If you haven't seen the article or the coverage, the debate that I have seen anyway is fairly straightforward and fairly common. Dr. Simone has argued that we should eliminate minimum wage requirements for foreign workers or migrant workers in agriculture or home health care, and perhaps across the board. Right. He makes a couple arguments for this, but I'll focus on one that's directly relevant. And here I quote, he said in a newspaper report, the minimum wage is a social concept designed to protect society's weakest in the name of social solidarity. But that doesn't apply to citizens of foreign countries who would work here for a third of the salaries they get today. We aren't forcing anyone to come here. Even with lower pay, there will be those who want to come work in Israel. And it seems he's breaking with other economists, particularly at Treasury, who have long sought to ensure minimum standards at the bottom of the labor market for a variety of reasons. But in the coverage I saw, one of those reasons was to ensure that migrant workers didn't end up displacing citizens and recent immigrants from particular jobs. Okay, so how to frame this? I had a talk with Guy Mundluck that makes me want to sort of alter a tiny bit of what I'm going to say, but I will probably do it on the fly. Some of the coverage of this issue has posited a direct conflict between particular groups of workers, right? So Filipinos potentially taking home care jobs from recent immigrants from the Soviet Union, Thai agricultural workers from undercutting Israeli Arabs in the agricultural labor market, these types of direct conflicts. Those types of conflicts, at least in social space, rarely appear in a pure form in the US. Just in the sense that one doesn't often have kind of direct conflict between one group of workers who is in the process of being displaced by another group of workers. However, the general conflict is, I think, quite familiar from the U.S. context, where it's very often posited a sort of zero-sum game between native workers and immigrant workers, or one group of vulnerable workers and another group of vulnerable workers. It's a very, I think, it's a fascinating question because the way that these arguments are framed in public debates, they pose a set of conflicts between vulnerable workers, right? This is not a conflict between elite workers and vulnerable workers, or between labor and capital, but rather between two subordinate groups of workers. Progressives tend to have sympathy both for recent lawful immigrants from the USSR, for example, and for migrant workers from the Philippines. And I'm not sure, despite my earlier argument, that a simple appeal to a value of social equality resolves such conflicts, or at least it needs to be built out a little bit. Because on its face, a commitment to equal social standing could be applied solely to fellow citizens, for example. Or it could be applied to all individuals within jurisdictional boundaries, or to all individuals with a sufficient connection to the jurisdiction, so that social norms and legal protections attach. So we might say everyone within the country deserves equal treatment. Or we might say everyone lawfully within the country deserves equal treatment. Of course, Simone, am I saying? Okay, thank you. I wrote it incorrectly in the paper, and so I keep tripping up. He's saying one group of people who is, if I'm understanding, in the country lawfully should be given fewer rights because they would be in the country as guest workers or migrant workers permitted to enter but then denied full protections under the laws. And in defending that argument, he appeals to a conception of social equality, right? Let me recite his argument again. The minimum wage is a social concept designed to protect society's weakest in the name of social solidarity. But that doesn't apply to citizens of foreign countries who would work here for a third of the salaries they get anyway. Essentially, migrant workers are not deserving of social equality. Social equality applies among, some group of workers that is comprised of citizens, lawful immigrants, others who are in the country permanently. So I disagree with his line drawing quite strongly, but I did want to highlight it because I do think it is at least a coherent place to draw a line. And he's not alone in drawing a line in this way. In fact, Rawls, in later work and in Theory of Justice, said justice is really a quality of states, essentially, right? It can only be achieved among citizens in some way. His principles apply in the context of a political society that is represented by a nation state. How else might we think about this? I will highlight Iris Marion Young's alternative model that she calls a social connection model, which I think is not sort of fully fleshed out. She died while she was developing it, But in its simplest form, she states that all agents who contribute by their actions to structural processes that produce injustice have responsibility to remedy those injustices. And her paradigm example is global production structures for clothing. She looks to global labor markets to build out this argument and says Western consumers who are getting garments sewn in sweatshops in Bangladesh, for example, have duties toward those workers, as do the companies that are selling, sourcing and selling those clothes. There are not many legal duties today that actually apply in that circumstance. She's saying we need to create. She's saying, I think there is a commonsensical moral duty and we can eventually start to build out a legal duty, but I don't think she quite succeeded in that regard. In any event, that's a different issue from whether migrant workers should have all labor rights within host countries. But what I think Yeln's model does quite nicely is it focuses on the structural connections between institutions that give rise to labor conditions. So in her schema, one might say, first, host countries owe some duties toward workers seeking to migrate, regardless of whether they're in the country yet or not, because host countries have participated in structural processes, trade, foreign investment, global financial flows, the very Westphalian system of nation states and citizenship regimes that end up pushing individuals to migrate in some ways and pulling them into host countries. Second, one might argue that host countries, I am arguing, that host countries owe stronger duties toward workers who are within their borders than to workers outside the country, at least in many circumstances. Once one is in the country and working and therefore contributing to a social product, some duties of mutual support and recognition attach. Third, somewhat more tentatively, actually, I'm not even going to put that on the table. Okay. So there's a question of where exactly we draw the boundaries of justice, right? And what I want to argue is perfectly plausible and I think far desirable to say that those who are within the country and are participating in the labor market deserve full protections under labor laws for all of the reasons that I outlined earlier. But one does have to do a little bit of work to explain exactly why individuals who are not citizens do deserve those protections. I think it's because they are contributing, they are enmeshed in social processes that also enmesh citizens. Citizens are gaining benefits from their labor. This is a sort of social relationship that mirrors in some ways the employer-employee relationship, like the reciprocal employer-employee relationship that gives rise commonsensically to some duties of solidarity and mutual support. So in other words, I would side strongly with Yelm on this question. As long as migrants are in the country, they're clearly part, and here I'll stop, clearly part of a national community. Social equality requires that their contributions to the social product be honored and respected, and that the costs of low-wage labor, or the cost of the work being performed by individuals who are brought into the country, be shared among those that benefit from it. Minimum wages are, of course, a startlingly effective way of encouraging economic equality, and if they lead to other downstream harms like unemployment or high costs for elder care, we can deal with that through other social policies rather than positing a conflict between workers and elders. There is a deeper reason for skepticism about the proposal as well, which is that it would tend to create, or would encourage the creation of a caste of low-wage laborers, of the sort that Anderson explicitly condemns. It is a major risk when we deny full labor protections of any sort to migrants that they will end up in extremely exploitative labor relationships. Without the right to change jobs, they're at the risk of compulsory labor. Without the right to collective representation, they're at risk of underpayment or wage theft. Without the right to minimum wages, they're casted by the state as less worthy of protection than natives and citizens. Does anyone really doubt that this sort of a denial of rights would, even beyond its economic effects, encourage employers to treat migrants as somehow less human than others? Final point. So there are, in the design of social policy, we obviously face difficult trade-offs all the time, right? And surely in some situations one would have to judge the merits of a trade-off between recent immigrants or native citizens who are subordinate workers and migrant workers and determine exactly how to balance their rights. And by one framing of the issue, we face a tragic choice. Do we set a high wage floor and restrict migration in order to ensure fair wages to citizens? This was the argument of one Treasury economist. Or do we pay migrants less while reserving privileged labor market positions for citizens? It does seem like a stark choice, but it's actually a false dichotomy in some ways. Because denial of full rights to either group would actually serve the interests of capital, frankly. And if it isn't politically plausible to deny full rights to citizens, then migrants would be the default target. Denying them full rights would, though, encourage businesses to push for more migration, to push for lower wages, and to push for lower wages by native workers, again, bolstering capital's power vis-a-vis labor. This is by no means the whole story, right? Here as elsewhere, geopolitics, religion, race, and other social factors play into exactly how we are structuring and governing labor markets. But the kind of trade-off that is very often posited in these debates, and I think repeated in some of the articles I've seen, just appears far more acute when capital's interests are normalized rather than subjected to critical scrutiny. So I'll stop there. Thank you very, very much, and I look forward to all of your comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brishan, for what will surely be a great launch for the panel that we're going to have. So first we're going to have Professor Guy Moonlak, a professor of law here at Tel Aviv University with a shared appointment with the Department of Labor Studies. He wrote many key articles on labor law and labor migration in and outside of Israel. He's currently working on a book project about labor organizing from above and from below, as well as a project about Israel's recent wave of unionization. I think, do you want to come over here or do you want to sit over there? Whatever you choose. I think it'll be better for the video if you come over here. You are in good company, but you'll be in good company here too. You can just sit here and then.
Thanks, Brishan. I think that sometimes it's expected the discussant will come with some major objections. I read this article a few years ago. I love it. I think it's really important. And when I thought what I want to talk about here, I want to take two things from the article. First of all, taking away the discussion of minimum wage from the big question that everyone talks about. What are the consequences of minimum wage on unemployment, on wage equity, on gender wages? This is the usual. And some of these studies are exceptionally interesting, both innovative in their methodology and in their findings, and actually talking about the connection between minimum wage and self-respect. And I think that another thing here is the connection between respect and community. So this is not merely a respect that one person experiences from another, but it's a respect that one person feels that he receives or she receives from the community as a whole. And the second major component, I think, is the idea of employers' responsibility. And all of this will be leading to, if I need a one-liner so that you can just kind of like fade out for the next 10 minutes, and I doubt that you will disagree about this, minimum wage is not a fixed concept. There are all kinds of ways to think about minimum wage, and I think that in order to really underscore what you're arguing, then we need to talk about living wage rather than minimum wage. So that will be the major issue here, and I'll also talk about it in the global perspective. The thing is that there is the objective here of fostering a sense of an egalitarian community, which I think is really important. Now, usually when we think about the egalitarian community, we think about either the nation state or some kind of a territorial unit. But the thing is that, and you mentioned that when you spoke here, respect is a subjective feeling that someone feels in real life. It's not just a concept. So if I feel respect at work, I need some kind of a context. It's some kind of a real relationship. I think like trust. And the thing is that the actual experience where people feel that they receive respect is at the workplace, rather than a general idea that, hey, the state raised the minimum wage and there comes your stylized worker from the 1930s and say, now I feel that I've been respected. I don't think that most people feel that they're respected if the state raises the minimum wage. And actually, we know that one of the paradoxes in rights language is that people feel that if they have a right, that they are entitled to it, and that kind of like creates the baseline. So you're not being appreciative of being respected. You do not feel that you've gone through some kind of a change or anything. Now you're entitled to it, and that's one of the major advantages of the thing. Another thing here is, and therefore the experience of respect should be centered at the workplace. And the other aspect is that if we're talking about the importance of employers' responsibility to the workers, as opposed to the state's responsibility to the population as a whole, then again we would like to focus on the workplace. Now, if the state authors the right, the state authors the minimum wage, then the employers and the employees are passive recipients of the right. And when we're thinking about T.H. Marshall and his idiosyncratic category of industrial citizenship, one of the ideas of industrial citizenship is that people should actually act up in order to get their rights, unlike, for example, welfare provisions. So the tension here is that we're thinking about an egalitarian community, the state, but we would like to see some kind of authoring of the norm in the workplace. Now, why should an employer advance a minimum wage in the workplace? Well, evidently they do sometimes. Taking Ford as the main example, Ford raised wages, I think, 5 times as high as the market wages as part of a business policy. Employers sometimes raise minimum wages as part of their human resource policy. Collective bargaining can raise minimum wages. Social movements, sometimes together with business, can raise minimum wage. In a study I did with Asaf when we looked into new collective agreements in new organizing attempts, then we saw that part of the deal that the Histadrut now is doing is that A, they ask to raise the minimum wage at the enterprise level. B, they have a flat wage hike for all of the workers. In exchange, they give the management half of the wage addition pie for the management to distribute according to their rationales and incentive packages. But part of the idea was that half of the wage benefits for the next year or 2 years have to be given to everyone, including raising the minimum wage. And this is a form of creating a community. Now, if minimum wages, we expect it to be established only in the workplace, then we're going to have maybe islands of minimum wages around. And the question, we would like to actually have this in a broader level. Now, minimum wage, when we look at the minimum wage now, it's 5,300 shekels. Why 5,300 shekels?
Per month?
Because it's per month, yeah. Because it's more than 5,000 shekels before, which was the previous sum, and it's less than 5,800 shekels. And what does it designate? Probably nothing. If it's rationalized, it's usually based on economic studies where they try to figure out the tipping point of when it's going to be dangerous. Because everyone agrees that if we raise minimum wage to 10,000 shekels, that's going to have bad consequence for the market. So 5,300 shekels, I don't know, it's a political compromise. It's done behind the scenes. A lot of time minimum wage was established 20 years ago, and then it was indexed or tied to cost of living adjustments. It doesn't really, it's an arbitrary sum. If we look at living wage campaigns in municipalities, in states, we actually expect to see a different kind of discourse. One that starts with a different kind of question, and not with the economists' concern about what's the tipping point, but with actually asking, what does it take in order to make a living? Now, this is a difficult question, and we know it also from the welfare law context. You know, what is the threshold for human dignity? That was the way that it was framed in Israel, in Germany, and other countries. And there are all kinds of ways to do it. And you can try to measure it vis-a-vis the minimum wage. You can try to see that we have a growing share of what's called the working poor. Families with two people who are in the labor market working on minimum wage, and they're still considered to be in poverty. Yeah, that should be kind of an index. We can look at expenses. We can look at, there are various systems to calculate this. But this is the kind of deliberation that we would like to actually start seeing at the municipal level, where a lot of the living wage campaigns have been done, at the national level, where there's and not to start from the economic. Now, it doesn't mean that after figuring out the living wage, you cannot bring in the economic studies. But these are supposed to be a second order if we start from your point of departure about respect. In the living wage campaigns, we see there are multiple agents. We see consumers are involved. And if it's living wage in the public authorities, then that actually may mean greater taxation, and that should be part of the debate. And if it's for the private sector employers, that may mean higher prices, and that should be part of the debate. In a footnote, I'll say a lot of time raising the minimum wage does not affect the high-end consumers you suggested. There is no connection between, and I'll talk about multinationals, there is no connection between how much a worker earns in Cambodia and how much you pay for an H&M t-shirt. I mean, these are two different systems of calculation. But we do want to see this kind of deliberative effect that will give actually more body to the idea of respect and employers' responsibility. So the living wage has the advantage that it's being discussed in different terms. It places the workers at the center. The wage itself, unlike basic income, unlike subsidies, unlike negative income tax, places the responsibility on the employer. The community is actually constituted by the process. So the question is, what is the community? We need to bear in mind that it's not an a priori question. We also build the community through processes of minimum or living wage. There is the deliberative process, and as I said, it doesn't make the economic considerations redundant. 2 minutes I have. One is multinationals. If we look at corporate social responsibility starting around the early 90s, and I think pretty much around the time when the living wage campaigns in the United States, mostly in the United States, started, corporate social responsibility at that time dealt with anti-slavery and prohibition on child labor. At a later stage, it started talking about wages, but in terms of respecting minimum wages in the countries where there is a minimum wage. At a later stage, it started talking about living wage, not as substituting minimum wage, but as topping minimum wage over and above. And we see this as part of a growing, it's a growing thing with multinational, not only about wages, but also, for example, if we take child labor, where at the beginning we had prohibition on child labor, now we see in corporate codes like in H&M, if we find that there is child labor down the supply chain, H&M has to fund schooling. It's not about a negative right. It's about the right to education and the right to dignified living, and open a job if after school the kid wants to come back and work down the supply chain of H&M. And I think that this is part of this idea that a living wage comes together with other more positive rights ideas in multinationals, and there is a whole discussion on how this developed in multinationals, and for time constraints, I won't go into that now, but we can open that. And I think that that's an interesting example of community building in a corporate chain, which raised the question, but then you're going to have a factory in Bangladesh that's going to have a living wage according to H&M, and a factory that's going to have a living wage according to Nike, and you're going to have islands of living wage. But a recent ILO study revealed that actually raising wages in the suppliers working for the multinationals starts pulling up wages in the countries where these factories are. So I think this is one way of trying also to affect, both to think of creating a community that is at the multinational and not a territorial community, but also affecting territorial communities. And the living wage here, we always have to remember it's about defining for our community what do we consider to be a living wage. And that finally brings me to the other side of the globalization, and that's the migration. I think that in your paper you give very important tools for actually making the claim why migrants should be a part of the minimum or living wage. There is a risk here. If we're talking about living wage, then one would say, but the living wage of Filipina are actually cheaper because mostly they send it as remittances back to the Philippines, and therefore we should calculate their living wage according to Philippine standards and not according to Israeli standards. So I think that here the attempt actually when talking about living wage is talking that we are the relevant community here. So you bring a quote from Walzer that talks about citizenship as a status radically disconnected from every kind of hierarchy. But we have to remember that for Walzer, if we bring in migrant workers, and that's fine if we want, and it's fine if we don't want, whatever we want, but if we bring migrant workers, they should also have a right to vote. So clearly this should be part of the community for the living wage. So I'm leaving that aside. But you make the argument, which I totally agree, that minimum wage or living wage compensate workers, however partially, for the difficulties and indignities of such work, or that the harsh condition and status harms of low-wage employment do not occur in a vacuum. Employers and managers enjoy individualized and institutional benefits from workers' efforts. And if we are bringing the migrant workers to do the jobs that no one else wants to do here, and that's actually the case, we're not bringing them to do the jobs that everyone wants to do and that they're taking the jobs from all the local people. And if someone thinks that they are, it's because the state wants people to kind of like divide and conquer among the population. So actually there is a strong case looking at what's their role in the Israeli population to say that they deserve extra compensation for their efforts and for what they bring into the labor market. And I think that should probably be a major argument, which again requires to move away from considering it on an individualized economic issue that looks at the opportunity wage in Romania or Qatar or Dubai. As long as we remain at the individualist economic discourse, then it's really, it may be a coherent argument. And I think that the article here provides a very good way of thinking about this, both in terms of respect and community, and thinking about how the living wage or minimum wage should actually be a way of constituting the community here.
Thank you very, very much, Guy. Our next panelist is going to be Hani Ben Israel. Hani is a master's student, soon a PhD student, here at Tel Aviv University Faculty of Law. Before returning, she also teaches at the College of Management in Rishon LeZion. Before returning to law school, she worked at Kav La'Oved and litigated with some of the people around this table, some, if not all, the most important cases that have to do, that challenged Israel's temporary migrant worker regime. And she's also a Traf Lab research team member. And do you want your PowerPoint? Should I turn it on? No? Okay. So just plug this on.
Yep. This is good. Okay. Hello, everyone. This is such an interesting discussion, and I'm very grateful for the invitation. I said this before, and I'll say again. I really enjoyed the article. I think it's a very.
A little bit. Could you speak up a little bit?
זה אמור לדלוק?
לא יודעת. כן, זה אמור לדלוק.
Okay. It's a very compelling, moving even, defense of the right to minimum wage, and perhaps labor law more generally. In my comments, I want to try to link that discussion, albeit somewhat loosely, to the current discussion taking place in Israel that is really troubling for a lot of us here around the table. And that really has to do with the recent proposal to exclude migrant workers from the right to minimum wage. A discussion started with the proposal by Professor Avi Simchon, the Prime Minister's economic advisor and head of the National Economy Council, basically saying migrant workers need to be excluded from the minimum wage law. So that piece, it was a DeMarker piece published a month ago, immediately gained traction. Several similar pieces made for headlines soon after were published in Haaretz, in Israel Hayom. It also got some radio coverage. This may not seem too important, but I mention this because I think there's something to be taken from this interest in Simchon's ideas, from their appeal and their popularity, with substantial elements in the Israeli public, popularity that extend beyond just employer groups that stand to benefit directly from such an exclusion. So quite in the beginning of the article, there's an important reference, I think, for any discussion concerning the minimum wage, which is the overwhelming political popularity of the minimum wage. A popularity transcending, as Brishan mentions, income groups, political affiliation, and racial identity. And I think in Israel, too, the recent substantial increases to the minimum wage enjoyed a rather broad social and political support from right and from left. But this popularity, again, transcending many divides, does not necessarily transcend divides along lines of citizenship and status. And I think it's important to recognize that when migrants are the beneficiaries of the right to a minimum wage, that right does not enjoy the same kind of popularity, the same kind of public support, and is in fact faced by a powerful counter sentiment. In the context of migrant workers in Israel, the discussion is framed now not so much as a discussion of minimum wage versus direct transfers, a discussion really illuminated from an ethical and a normative perspective in Brishan's article, but a subsidiary question of universalism versus selectivity in the application of labor laws, minimum wage specifically. The idea is that while minimum wage can be desirable, it's not necessarily desirable universally, not for everyone. It should be applied selectively, and it should benefit selectively. And as we well know, there has been a trend away from universalism over the past decades in the application of labor laws to a regime where only selected groups are covered in practice, and migrant workers are certainly a very illustrative example of this trend. Brishan chose the same quotation from Professor Simchon's proposal, but I'll quote it again because I think it's of consequence. He says, minimum wage is a social idea meant to provide protection to the disadvantaged workers in society in the name of social solidarity, but that solidarity does not apply to citizens of foreign countries. Coming here is lucrative for migrants, even for a third of the wage they receive today. And I think that in these short sentences, Simchon captures several basic sentiments that tend to animate the selective approach towards immigrants. For example, that the boundaries of citizenship mark or should mark the boundaries of social solidarity in the labor market. The differential treatment of migrants is justified and at the very least unproblematic, that the wage gap between Israel and migrants' countries of origin is a normative justification for excluding migrants from the law on minimum wage, a position that implies migrants themselves are somehow benefiting disproportionately from the fruits of labor migration, like they're the big winners of globalization and so forth. So there's quite a lot to unpack here, and I chose today to talk in an entirely non-exhaustive ways about three issues I think are of significance. The first is a descriptive point, and it has to do with the actual scope of the minimum wage law. The second is a normative point, which is the unique importance of the minimum wage law as well as other cogent labor legislation for migrants. And thirdly, again, a normative point, and this kind of goes to where Guy ended his comments, the place of the wage gap between country of origin and country of destination in the normative debate over minimum wage for migrant workers. So first point, I think, is really worth putting on the table. Simchon's proposal to exclude migrant workers from the minimum wage law is premised on the implied assumption that minimum wage law does in fact apply to migrant workers. And this is not necessarily true. This is not necessarily the case. It's perhaps a trivial observation to those of us familiar with the particularities of the legal regime applied to migrant workers, but I think it's really worth clarifying. While migrants are formally covered by the law on minimum wage, they are de facto indirectly already excluded from it in several different important ways. And this means really that the real question is not if to exclude migrant workers from the law on minimum wage, but rather if to exclude them further from the law on minimum wage. So we can think of many modes of indirect exclusion of migrants from the minimum wage law. For example, brokerage fees, the topic of our previous event, can be seen as a phenomenon that robs migrants their right to a minimum wage for rather lengthy periods of time in which they pay back their loans, or lax enforcement of labor laws, which is a structural feature of low-wage migrant or minority-dominated labor sectors. In this sector, there is already a de facto market wage. The norm for Thai workers in agriculture, for example, has very consistently throughout the years been about 70% of the minimum wage. But there are more direct modes of still indirect exclusion that I would like to highlight. That's unlike enforcement, which is a problem faced by Israeli workers as well, are migrant-specific. So, for example, in the caregiving sector, migrant workers were excluded from the hours of work and rest law as a result of Gloten versus the National Labor Court, originally decided in 2009, reapproved by an extended panel of justices in 2013. Gloten was about migrant care workers who provide round-the-clock care to care recipients, with the question being the right to overtime pay in accordance with the hours of work and rest law. The law governs various fundamental issues, including overtime pay and weekly rest, and Gloten basically categorically excluded some 60,000 workers from the right to overtime pay and legitimized the round-the-clock employment for minimum wage only, while formally this is only an exclusion from the hours of work and rest law. This is in fact also an indirect exclusion from the law on minimum wage, because workers who work on a 24-hour basis are now paid the minimum wage for only 8. And the reasoning in Gloten actually quite echoes Simchon's sentiments expressed in the article in The Marker, with Justice Rivlin saying that even with overtime pay, migrant care workers benefit from higher wages relative to their home countries, and increasing labor costs will adversely impact demand, reducing prospects for migration. Additionally, migrants' families usually stay behind, a fact that influences the financial burden of providing for them with an Israeli minimum wage. Asylum seekers are too excluded de facto from the minimum wage law as a result of the deposit law, an amendment to the migrant workers law passed in 2016 in order to incentivize or force asylum seekers to voluntarily leave the country. The amendment requires employers of asylum seekers to deduct 20% of their workers' monthly salaries to a government account, with the accumulated sum becoming redeemable by the asylum seeker only when he or she leaves Israel. And this has naturally led to a dramatic wage decrease for asylum seekers already employed in menial, precarious, low-paying jobs who, as a result of the deposit law, are paid substantially less, 20% less than the minimum wage, driving thousands of asylum seekers into even deeper poverty and desperation. And a final example is migrant workers in agriculture, where creative ways were found to de facto exclude them as well from the minimum wage law. Just last July, the Knesset Labor, Welfare and Social Services Committee basically caved to a persistent and powerful lobby of employers in agriculture to reduce labor costs in agriculture, and decided on a substantial increase to the sum employers in agriculture may deduct from their workers' wages for housing and related expenses, setting it on over threefold of the previous rates. And this increase was not tied to any new obligations with respect to housing conditions for employers, which in agriculture are quite bad and often unsafe. So now employers can legally deduct over 500 shekels from their workers' wages, driving them further below the minimum wage. Furthermore, about a quarter of the labor force in agriculture are currently migrants labeled volunteers or students, which is the market's creative response to the demand for cheap labor in agriculture, beyond the quotas for migrant workers approved by the government. While these migrants work full-time and beyond, they are not considered workers, but students or volunteers, and some are paid as low as 15 shekels an hour, with the government vigorously supporting and defending these programs. So to sum this point, migrants are already excluded in substantial ways from the minimum wage law. This should be really the starting point of any, I think, conversation about migrant workers and the minimum wage. And it seems that the experience amassed thus far with labor conditions in migrant-dominated sectors shows unequivocally that what workers need is more coverage and more protection and not less. A second thing I want to note in the context of this debate is really the unique role of minimum wage and other cogent labor legislation for migrants. And the point here is quite a simple one. Cogent labor legislation is very important for migrants, and that has to do with the structural arrangements for the employment of migrants, which deeply disadvantage them as labor market actors. We know that modern labor law stands on three pillars: on contract, expressing the voluntary and uncoerced nature of labor relations; on protective labor legislation, supplementing workers' contractual status with a minimum of non-negotiable rights; and collective bargaining, allowing workers to negotiate collectively for their conditions of employment. The labor law that applies to the work of migrant workers doesn't really stand on these three traditional pillars. In terms of migrants' right to contract, meaning to negotiate with employers, to utilize their bargaining power, that is severely limited as a result of employer sponsorship. A common feature of guest worker programs tying working for a specific sponsor and employer to legality. In terms of collective bargaining, there's a lot to be said about the relationship between migrants and trade unions, but suffice to say that there's a serious representation gap of migrants and their interests in trade unions. In Israel, up until 2010, migrants were not allowed to become members of the Histadrut, the largest trade union in Israel, and to this day it's quite rare to see migrants organizing in an attempt to bargain collectively or to see them meaningfully represented by a trade union. So in this unique and very limiting setting, where workers are denied significant dimensions of their labor market power and their collective power, protective labor legislation is acutely significant. It's certainly not sufficient as a barrier against exploitation, but it has a cardinal role, again, in this unusually limiting structure. And it's often a sole avenue of power and recourse for migrants. And unfortunately, as we have seen, there's a problem of exclusion with protective labor legislation too, a trend that I would argue should be reversed, not widened further. And finally, the wage gap argument. The normative arguments Simchon and others raise, this was raised in Gluten as well, in support of excluding migrants from the minimum wage law, is the extent of the wage gap. The notion that there's no justification to pay a migrant 7 times the wage of his or her home country. And this argument also relies on the fact that migrants usually support their families that stay behind. Hence, the relevant costs of consumption or salaries buying power are those of the country of origin and not the country of destination, since migrants don't support families here. And this is really a very prevalent thing to hear in the public debate about the rights of migrant workers. And a very similar version of it, as I mentioned, was in fact accepted by our Supreme Court in Gluten. And I would like to suggest that this is a very unattractive, a very problematic way to think both about migrants and about the minimum wage, as it requires that we adhere to 2 very problematic assumptions. The first is that non-citizen workers are outsiders to our society and to our economy, and hence the relevant metric for them should be the wage rate in their countries of origin. And second, that the social function of minimum wage is limited to providing greater purchasing power for low-wage workers. So starting with the first point, can migrant workers in Israel be convincingly portrayed as temporary outsiders? And I think they can't. We know now, after 3 decades of labor migration to Israel, that labor migration is not a temporary phenomenon, but a permanent characteristic of the labor market. Moreover, individual migrant stay in Israel is too not necessarily short nor temporary. Migrant caregivers, for example, may stay in Israel for decades legally if they continue working for the same employer. So portraying migrants as temporary outsiders, normative considerations aside for a minute, is simply not true. Secondly, there's something quite troubling, I find, with referencing the fact that migrants don't support a family here, but back in their country of origin as reason for their exclusion from the law on minimum wage, given our coercive involvement in that choice. The reason that migrants support their families back home is at least partly the fact that we do not allow migrants.
Example from the Israeli labor market, and to address 2 trends taking place in recent years in Israel. As Guy mentioned, the Israeli minimum wage increased during the last 5 years in around 20%. It's amazing. It's great development due to very effective public campaign directed to the General Trade Union Federation, the Histadrut, as well as to policymakers in the parliament. It was effective and great development. But on the meantime, the state enforcement capacities facing quite continued stagnation and weakness, and one may say a gradual drift, showed in the unequal growth of the labor market and the relevant governmental unit. These 2 parallel trends led to a situation of migrant workers in agriculture, as Hani mentioned, being paid around 70% of the legal minimum wage, and both migrant and Palestinian workers' rights being violated as a common practice, whether through basic wages non-payment or violation, or other social benefits, or even security, life security in construction sites. Analyzing minimum wage laws in this context of one may call it neoliberal capitalism, should take into consideration these two parallel trends. The neoliberal state ignores the importance of implementing these great changes even when they happen, and they do happen quite rarely, in low-wage sectors, occupying mainly weak workers, suffering from intersectional marginalities. But this is not only an issue of minimum wage or migrant workers. Research demonstrates that outsourcing practices also leads to decreasing chances of employers' compliance to these minimum labor standards, while hardening inspection and enforcement of labor rights, thus promoting a decline of social equality or fair work-based social relations. This situation widened the given inequality amongst workers and is characterized by sectoral features, not only national ones, of workers' social characteristics, of trade union representational strategy, migration policies, etc., etc. In order to tackle this labor market segmentation, I would like to offer in my very short discussion that mechanisms of social and economic inequality should be analyzed through a perspective of the evolving capitalist institutional order in both national and sectoral level. The minimum wage, as a mechanism aiming to reduce social and economic inequality, should be considered together with other workers' rights and social institutions enabling the workers' rights enforcement. The neoliberal order promotes continued retraction of state involvement. And even when the state takes place and legislate minimum labor standards, national budgetary limitations reduce the state's ability to enforce these new legislation or existing workers' rights. This global trend harms workers differentially. Female migrant workers, low-wage, non-unionized workers, to name but a few of these marginalities in the labor market, more than others. Thus, it reproduces and even widens social and economic inequalities. This exposure of low-wage workers to exploitative practices inflict on their industrial citizenship, as Guy mentioned before. While native Jewish workers enjoy higher wages and great access to enforcement mechanisms, Palestinian workers are subject to a military permissions regime and nationalist discrimination. Migrant workers are subject to a different migration policy, a different social segregation and language difficulties, inflicting on their accessibility to enforcement as working agent or industrial citizens. This situation fragments the social and its ability to promote work-based fairness. While labor rights should create an equal basis, their respective enforcement mechanisms should be unequal or corrective and to be adapted to specific sectors or workers' groups and their needs. Facing this context, I would like to stress that Britain's new theoretical justifications for minimal labor standards should be placed in the frame of criticizing neoliberalism, its mobility regime, and its deriving multiple inequalities. Doing so, the social fairness and egalitarian policies need to be focused on the adequate societal means that will address work-based rights and their enforcement as a means to promote workers' agency and egalitarian industrial citizenship as part of a given community. I would risk to suggest that this link between basic rights legislation and enforcement and workers' agency should actually take place in the debate around the freedom of association and unionization. In order to explain the importance of analyzing enforcement measures in neoliberal labor markets, I would give another short example from two Israeli sectors, the construction sector and the agriculture. As many of low-wage sectors in Israel, these two were regulated and still are regulated by collective agreements for several decades. But although central union regulations, workers were continuously exploited while employers ignored the legally binding labor rights. The existence of a representative trade union was not enough, as for many years it ignored its mission to enforce workers' rights. It still ignores them in some of the cases, thus subjecting low-wage workers, characterized, as Brishan rightly note, by racial or gender features, to exploitation, and institutionalizing these sectors as giving demeaning jobs and employing weak workers. Although established labor rights, the trade union neglected their mobilization and representation, and the weak workers had very low accessibility to Israeli enforcement agencies. The situation in construction sector was partially changed in recent years, after Palestinian workers started to enjoy greater accessibility to court. It was not intentional. It just, in Israel, we produced many, many, many lawyers that have few jobs. These labor lawyers filed tons of lawsuits against exploitative employers.
So I'm gonna take a cue, and if anybody wants to comment or ask questions, and I want to encourage students, especially Yarin, to ask questions.
I understand all the pros and cons of minimum wage, but what do you do when the minimum wage becomes the maximum wage? What do you do in sectors where employers decide that instead of the minimum wage being an anchor for something that you won't go below, it can be the top for the worker? You can work for 20 or more years and still earn the same stated by law. And something that we see in the 30 sector here in Israel, especially with my children. And we actually see employers who find out that they paid a little above the minimum. When they realize that they could pay less, they ask to automatically deduct whatever extras there were. Because, as I said, the minimum becomes the maximum.
Want to take a few questions?
Yeah, I think so. I'm just gonna go around the table. I didn't see.
Okay, hi. So thank you for this really important and enlightening paper. I have a conceptual question about the relationship between self-respect and social equality. Sometimes the paper suggests that social equality causes self-respect. We see this on page 22 and page 31.
Somebody read closely.
Yeah. Well, just because it's so interesting and important. So, but at other times it seems that social equality is really the end goal. I mean, the title alone. And sometimes it seems like self-respect is a component of social equality, or the reverse. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that. Thank you.
I think we'll take 3 and then additional 3. So,
my question is a follow-up. So if the main justifications for an equal minimum wage are dignity and an equal place in society, and taking in mind that part of the main reasons that these workers were brought in the first place is that they are easier structurally to ignore and take advantage of, if that doesn't actually prove that we are in a kind of dead end in promoting equal minimum wage, because the policy designers are so further off from these goals. Not sure.
Could you maybe restate the question?
So I think, if I understood correctly, the main justifications that were brought up here today for an equal minimum wage for migrant workers as well are dignity and an equal place in the society in which they take part. But the very reason that they were brought in the first place, maybe if not in the stated version, they are easier to take advantage of. So that kind of paradox is what I wanted to ask.
Okay. So these are fantastic questions. I sort of want to just kick them over to the panel to answer them honestly. On the the first is sort of, in terms of policy, at least in theory, a little easiest to answer. If the minimum wage becomes a maximum wage, we have a few options. We can raise it through statute or administrative action. I think what this points to more, what your question points to more, is the need for worker voice, local workplace democracy, and other sorts of representative structures, right? Particularly unions, but they don't have to be unions in the way that we've traditionally thought of them. Some collective means for workers to bargain with employers, exert power vis-a-vis employers, and I think most importantly in this context, perhaps, ensure enforcement of minimum labor standards. So in the United States, certainly in the UK, I think, actually Asaf and Hani both referred to this, in Israel, enforcement of minimum standards is a major challenge, even if they're on the books. Obviously, enforcing minimum terms for some of the weakest parties in society is always a challenge, right? In the U.S., the rate of enforcement is substantial of workplace health and safety, for example, minimum wage, maximum hours laws, and the like, is substantially higher in unionized workforces than in non-unionized workforces, because it means that you have an agent within the workplace that can actually ensure enforcement. Workers simply can't do alone. Whether that translates to the context of, for example, home care workers quite as easily is a different question, because you don't have collective power in that workplace in the same way, but one can have collective power in the sector or in the geography in some way in order to sort of encourage those goals. Second question, I'll take the third question next. So dignity and equality, and yet, workers have been brought in precisely for the reason that they are, easier to treat in an undignified way. I guess I think there's sort of two cases here. One case is the just average, very low-skilled worker or, otherwise subordinated worker who has citizenship rights, right? Who is in the country, is not denied full citizenship rights in some way. The other case is a worker without full citizenship rights who comes in as a guest worker or migrants in some capacity. Again, I think it points to very difficult questions of enforcement, and in some ways, I want to kind of kick this a little bit to the notions of community and how legal regulations constitute community that both Hani and, am I pronouncing Hani, right? Close enough, I'm sorry, okay. I'm sorry. As one with a strange name, myself, I'm the only person in the US who has this name, so whatever.
Hani is not a strange name.
I of all people should be, an I of all people should, take extra care, right? Should constitute a community by making sure that I know how to pronounce
You
names.
got in trouble with the Workers' Center, just move on, man. You're not gonna...
All right. I want to kick it back to the discussions of community and the constituting of community, right? Yes, right? The workers are brought into these relationships precisely because they don't have a whole lot of human capital, they're easy to exploit, etc. But this is the reason for the regulations in the first place. They may be difficult to enforce, but the anti-subordination goal or egalitarian goal behind the regulations becomes as important, I think, in those circumstances. Okay, self-respect and social equality. I don't recall exactly what I said on page 2731. I guess what I don't have a great answer to the question. Let me sort of riff on it very briefly, and then we'll get to others and we can talk maybe more about it afterwards. I think that what is, how many of you are students, by the way? Okay, about half, roughly, yeah, okay. So if you are going into teaching, you may end up having the experience of writing something and then going back and reading it later and thinking, it's not really what I would have done if you read it again in the future. I think I was attracted to the notion of social equality in this paper as an anchor for the paper because it adds a sort of focus on core aspects of human dignity that I think is lacking in a lot of the and this is an important phrase, sort of post-Rawlsian liberal egalitarian debates. I'm really thinking here of Dworkin, to an extent, even people like Jerry Cohen, Richard Arneson, right? A lot of the people who are developing these very kind of elaborate ways of thinking about distributive justice, but doing it with such abstraction that they end up losing part of what makes distributive justice important in the first place. And there's sort of a trace of this notion of, you could call it self-respect, or you could call it social equality, or you could call it dignity, that runs through a bunch of different critiques of mainline liberalism. And I will add that I actually think is very strongly represented in Rawls' own thoughts. I don't think that he was nearly as abstract in his discussion of these matters as many people read him as being. Especially if you read some of his later work, he was deeply focused on questions of basically the relationship between democracy and work, and democracy and capitalism, at least in points. So I guess the short answer to your question is, I think self-respect and social equality, and I would add dignity, are sort of overlapping values. And I see social equality as kind of a nice way of capturing all of them, but I will fully admit that it doesn't have I think it's sort of very intuitively understandable, and it's easy to identify in others' writings and easy to point to its violation, but it doesn't lend itself to quite as precise of a formulation of social duties as, say, Rawls' two principles of justice do, right? It doesn't get you to that kind of analytical clarity in quite the same way.
May I follow up? Probably not.
I'm sorry.
But get me afterwards.
Can I just say one thing to Edith?
The panelists, do you want to?
Yeah.
Just say for Edith, I agree with Prishan that in order to raise wages, you either need collective action, or in other ways you can lower the minimum wage a bit and open migration of domestic workers into the free market in Israel and let them play the market. And remove the agencies, remove a whole lot of things,
Yes.
and just let them stay here as many years as they want and play the market. They can earn a whole lot of money, as you see, like some of the caregivers. But if you want to see where minimum wage really turns formally into maximum wage, just kind of throwing it to you, I'll not go into the detail. Look at the Posted Workers Directive in Europe, where countries are not allowed to raise wages above minimum wage, because that will violate the freedom of movement, of capital, commodities, and stuff. And therefore there is a whole economic idea there that the minimum should remain, it should be the maximum. And there you will see a formal statement of what you were suggesting.
So this is also a little bit conceptual, partly because what do I know about labor law? So I really like the shift from distributive justice as something that cannot capture everything, and the ambition to find a satisfactory non-contingent foundation for minimum wage. But then at the end of the day, I think that you may have not shifted enough away from distributive justice, and therefore end up with something that is, to some extent, contingent when you talk about migrants. So one way to think about it, I think, is to think how would we think of a law that would say, assuming that we have in accident law strict liability, and would say, well, for tourists and migrants and others who are not citizens, it's going to be only negligence. And I think we would say, no, that can't be the case. And the reason why that is so intuitively clear is that that's not, I mean, there may be distributive issues, and it may be that we want to have some certain elements of social solidarity amongst we Israelites when we encounter accidents. But first and foremost, these are interpersonal interactions. So it's a question of relational justice and not distributive justice. So and like Liz Anderson and Sam Scheffler and some not the Dworkin and Jerry Cohens, but the Liz kind of people do try to move away from the distribution, but they don't move away from this all the way through. And I don't think that you move away all the way through, because if you would move all the way through, and if minimum wage is conceptualized as kind of the minimum standard of interpersonal relationship that we sanction in this country, the minimum conditions that below which we would not enforce contracts, for example, right? Then the answer is almost in the question, right? Then it surely applies to everyone, because it is not my capacity as an Israeli citizen is not even part of the equation, and therefore the capacity of the migrant worker as someone who is not a citizen is just irrelevant. So I do encourage you to shift a little bit more than, I mean, I like roles, but here I think you may be the problem. You're not liberal enough.
Yeah, so it might be unfair, but I would like to ask whether your project about minimum wage is also part of a project about maximum wages, and not in the sense that Edith mentioned, but in the sense of the wage gap. So my sense was that as you were describing what was your main interest, you're actually no less interested in the problem of gaps or of inequality, not in its abstract sense, but in its real inequality. And then I might say that minimum wage is just one part of the puzzle and not necessarily the most important one. Because if you really are interested in the dignity and respect that you're interested, perhaps differently than Hanoch is, and I think that there's definitely a disagreement among you about what it means, equal concern and respect or dignity, then aren't you messing with actually just the breadcrumbs that fall off the table? And this is not where we really want to focus our efforts. And also that it's not just about the real dignity that Guy was, for example, I think pushing you, not just as a concept, but also it's whether they feel dignified or not, then at least there is an argument to be made that the gaps are humiliating and not, and that this is of course, one of the problems of the political economy that you're describing. Also, just briefly, so I think that actually there's also, if you go down to the living wage rather than the minimum wage, where I see it as a community effort, is not just because people are focused on what does it really take to actually live a decent life, but also what does it take to have a community in which actually in this city we have all workers, right? Because part of the living wage campaign, the problem is that of course the low wage workers can't live here. They have to come from 2 hours away and they don't live here. So it's not just about whether they can buy something, but whether we live with all the people that, right, with a village around us, rather than with some kind of a very small segment. And just very briefly, the third, okay, I'll give you that.
That's it. Go.
Okay, so just really briefly.
You sound that pathetic, you can go for the second time.
Isn't it just because, yeah, exactly. Okay. So I'm actually worried that what we do reveal by the way we treat migrants is that it does reveal also the third and fourth rate citizens within our communities. So, and this of course just Marcus, right? I mean that the equal citizenship that we in fact produce is just so utterly unequal that we shouldn't be really surprised that no one seriously supports it.
That no one seriously
supports it. So if we anyway live in a world that has such clear classes, then might as well call them by their name and discriminate the migrants. We're discriminated, not me, right? I mean, but those, or at least very large segments of society that do support that, actually just view society, they see it as so heavily classist or class-based, so, might as well have some more classes. And the minimum wage just actually reinforces, this is the class of the minimum wage.
Does anybody know the percent of minimum wage earners in Israel? It's staggering, isn't it?
What?
The percent of people in Israel labor market that get minimum wage.
40%?
Something like 40%. I'm just thinking about classes. So we have Adi and then me.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm interested in the maximum wage, but not in the way it was stated here. And there's basically a tipping point where if we raise the minimum wage to an extent, then we will see a shift in factories going to third world countries. So I'm interested in your take, and where do we put a cap maybe to minimum wage in order to save work here or in countries of origin instead of transferring the work. So maybe the workers, if we would have risen the minimum wage further, we would shift more populations into poverty.
So clearly, I mean, at least last time I looked, the paper is not about migrant workers, but plainly it's been twisted, and I'm simply going to keep twisting. Because the commentary made it such a rich conversation about the relationship between sort of minimum wage, community membership within the nation state, and migrant workers and where they fit. And Asaf and Ami and Guy all also kind of challenged you to think about bringing, some of the ideas about dignity and membership that sort of down to earth and sort of about empowerment as well as sort of dignity in a more abstract notion. So what about this? Playing off Asaf and Guy's ideas about what's dignifying and empowering is the agency and ability to demand the rights. If the and Guy's notion of thinking about multiple communities and living wages in different places. And this is not a question so much for Brishan, I suppose, as for the panelists. It seemed to me elusive whether various people, commentators, were saying there must be a uniform minimum wage that applies alike to migrant workers and resident and citizen workers, or not. So to sharpen the point, let's take account of a living wage in Sri Lanka or Philippines or wherever the migrants are coming from. Let's calculate such a wage in the light of remittances and formalize a lower minimum wage for migrants, but genuinely guarantee the other kinds of rights that Asaf understood. The right to organize, the right to collective action, perhaps, and whatever sort of constellation of rights give them a measure of voice and security, but nonetheless take account of the gains to their own communities that flow. If you're not going to make them citizens anyway, and from my modest experience, often the sending country doesn't want you to, but yet you want to deal justly, perhaps that constellation of sort of keeping them, sort of sending remittances and ultimately going home, but nonetheless treating them justly in this sort of way that takes account of global inequalities.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay. We're kind of running out of time, really. So I'm going to give you 2 minutes, and I'm going to give the panelists 2 minutes, and then we're going to.
Okay. Briefly on obvious question. So if we do raise the minimum wage or collectively bargain wages so high that we end up pushing factories overseas, it's obviously an incredibly complicated question with a bunch of moving pieces. One thing that I would add that I think is insufficiently discussed in current public debates in the US is the following. Part of the goal of an overall labor market policy I don't think the goal of an overall labor market policy wants to be to return wages to post-World War II levels, which was based in part on a family wage ideology and a minimal welfare state, at least in the US, right? I think part of the goal of an overall labor and welfare policy is to ensure something like a middle class standard of living through a combination of collective bargaining, welfare, and social insurance rights. That may mitigate some of that risk, right, by socializing some of the costs that otherwise end up falling on employers in those situations. The very quick, I think, short response, that I'd love to talk more about this, is that in writing the paper, I wrestled quite a bit with the question of, the sort of fraught question of whether interpersonal, whether individuals can have duties that are grounded in distributive justice on the one hand, and then second, exactly how we think about the development and articulation of duties of corrective justice, and exactly how to work with that balance. One way, I think it's challenging, I think, though I'd be very interested to sort of hash it out with you. I think it's challenging to ground the minimum wage in a conception of corrective justice because it feels so distributive on its own. And it's not, the conditions that give rise to sub-minimum wage work are not conditions that are created by the employer. The employers, what's that?
I agree, it's not corrective justice, I didn't use the term.
No,
coincidentally.
Yeah. In any event, the question triggered this question for me, how do we draw the line between relational justice and corrective justice? How do we define interpersonal duties that apply as a matter of social norms across the board? And that's probably as much as I can say at the moment. I'll take advantage of the expiring clock. Ishai, finally, yeah, I agree on tackling maximum wages, and I agree that minimum wage is a small piece of the overall puzzle. I guess one thing I would just reflect back to you is the very significant. The way I think of this is sort of the terraforming of economic inequality, or the terraforming effect of economic inequality. When we have such dramatic economic inequalities, you end up with individuals living in bubbles of different sorts, right? In discrete social worlds, not interacting with one another. That also leads to patterns of household capital accumulation and the like that are quite difficult to reverse. Which is to say, it's a enormously challenging problem. I mean, I think collective bargaining is part of the solution, obviously. Extremely high taxation is part of the solution. But the overall task, I think, has to be really, at the end of the day, taking a whole lot of capital from one group in society and giving it to another group in society, and doing that through a combination of means.
Sounds like redistribution.
Others?
Let's hear it from the panelists. Annie, do you want to?
Just maybe with a comment about possibly supplementing, replacing minimum wage with other protections in a way that is to advance global equality. If I understood the comment correctly. I can just reiterate what I said in the presentation about really very limited scheme that we always encountering, but in the context of the export program, and that is in terms of responsorship. It's a very good market power with
ability to negotiate, to actualize relative negotiating power, plus very strained relationship with the climates, trading is. So I really don't see a replacement for a very robust regulation is
I would just say in a comment to your rightfully comment that the most prominent opponents of a universal minimum wage in some of the most egalitarian countries are the strong unions, as for example in Sweden or until lately in Germany, that say minimum wage actually harms and interfere with workers' representation and the equalizing effects of collective action. And I believe in a situation where we had a real strong and encompassing and democratic trade union federation in Israel, minimum wage would not be necessary, or universal minimum wage would not be necessary. But unfortunately, this is not the situation. So we have to settle with the second round.
Just quickly, I don't think minimum wage is front, right? And I think maximum wage is terribly important, like the 1 to 35 ratio decided here in the banking sector, but the effects and inequality as far as I know of minimum wage are much higher than the maximum wages, and the effects of the maximum wages are mostly expressive. But minimum wage, again, we're talking about a whole big class of people here who are living on minimum wage. So I think, but that's an important question I'm willing to open. But still, I think the minimum wage is hard to overcome. I would really be very hesitant about having an ILO index of each country to take the minimum wage. And if you come from Cambodia, you earn 0.7. And if you come from Sri Lanka, you earn 0.68, and will compensate for it by ensuring health and safety and freedom of association. A, because they don't believe it will ensure anything. B, if we don't give them minimum wage, we won't give them anything else, because the same argument will be on health and safety. And universal is universal. And I think that this is really a very significant, we hear both expressive and practical way of community, where the people who take care of our parents, build our schools, and pick our food from the fields are actually admitted to be part of the community. And I think this is more about constituting a community rather than questioning whether there is a community.
I would, the rate of U.S. workers making minimum wage is not 40%, but if the national minimum wage were raised to $15 an hour, that would impact the wages of around 43% of the workers in the U.S. So that would be a substantial, almost a majority of the population. And that is only the ones who would receive wages up to $50 an hour. Others would be on top.
So I would like to thank the Safra Center for Ethics and the Minerva Center for Human Rights for sponsoring this event. And I would like to thank Christian and our amazing panelists and all of you for sticking around. So thank you.